I knew I was being removed from my daughter's wedding before anyone said a word. It was written in the seating chart, in the way my name was placed far from the head tables, in how the room felt more like a boardroom than a celebration. The reception wasn't about family. It was about capital, introductions, futures already negotiated. When my son-in-law spoke casually about my land as if it were already theirs, as if my life's work were a line item, I stayed quiet. That silence was treated like defiance. My daughter didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She walked me out, past chandeliers and investors, and ended my place in her life that night. I'm telling you this because if you've ever been quietly erased by the people you built everything for, you'll understand what came next. If this story resonates, I hope you'll stay with me, subscribe, not for content, but for connection. And if you've lived something like this, share it below. Sometimes the only justice we get is being heard. The walkout was quiet. That was the part that stayed with me. No raised voices, no scene, just a hand at my elbow and a low instruction delivered like a correction. We moved past people holding champagne flutes and business cards, past banners with the company logo integrated into the wedding colors, until the carpet changed and the lighting dulled. I remember noticing the service corridor smelled faintly of bleach and coffee grounds, the kind of place meant for staff, not guests. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. Valets were busy laughing with men who had already forgotten why they were there. My car sat at the edge of the lot, older, practical, out of place among the polished imports. I drove home alone, hands steady on the wheel, watching reflections of the city slide across the windshield. The contrast wasn't just wealth. It was belonging. Inside that building, my value had already been reassigned. The days that followed were silent. No calls. No messages. I returned to my routines, early mornings, measured work, familiar roads. Silence can feel accidental at first. Then it settles into intention. By the third day, I understood, the distance wasn't an oversight. It was strategic. The silence after the wedding wasn't empty. It was structured. I could feel that even as I went back to my days the way I always had, up before sunrise, coffee black, the radio low, hands busy with things that made sense. Land has a rhythm. So does routine. Both tell you when something is being disturbed. No one reached out. Not my daughter. Not my son-in-law. Not a single message framed as concern or apology. That absence mattered more than anger would have. Anger is reactive. Silence is deliberate. I mended a fence on the north parcel that week. Replaced 2 posts that had started to lean after the last rain. I walked the boundary lines the way I had for years, boots sinking slightly into familiar soil, every marker exactly where I expected it to be. That land had never surprised me. People did. On the 4th day, the call came while I was at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork I'd already reviewed 100 times before. Her name on the screen didn't cause a spike of emotion. It felt inevitable, like weather you can see forming hours before it arrives. Her voice was calm. Warm, even. She didn't mention the wedding. Didn't acknowledge the way the night had ended. She spoke as if we were resuming a conversation paused mid-sentence, not one that had been severed. She talked about the future. About alignment. About how marriage had changed her priorities and how she needed to think bigger now. She said words like growth and positioning, words I recognized from meetings where outcomes were already decided. Then she introduced the real reason for the call. They needed land. Not all of it. Just a portion. Around 50 acres. The way she said it made it sound modest, almost considerate. She spoke about location advantages, access roads, how zoning wouldn't be a problem. She mentioned figures, valuation ranges, projected returns, that told me this wasn't a new thought. Research had been done. Conversations had happened. Decisions had been sketched out long before she dialed my number. She framed it as timing. Windows opening and closing. Investors needing reassurance. She said this opportunity wouldn't wait forever, and that family should move faster than strangers. She said that last part carefully, like she was offering me a role rather than demanding compliance. I listened. I let her finish. When she paused, expecting agreement or at least engagement, I asked a single question. I asked which parcel she meant. The pause on the line was brief, but it carried weight. In that pause was assumption, clear and unguarded. She had spoken as though ownership were a formality, as though my consent were procedural rather than essential. She answered eventually, naming the Eastern Tract, the one with the old access road and the cleanest title history. I told her I needed time. She shifted then, just slightly. Not angry. Not upset. Concerned. She reminded me of deadlines. Of people waiting. She said she didn't want this to become complicated. I told her I understood, and ended the call. Afterward, I sat there longer than necessary, the house quiet around me. I thought about how easily she had stepped into a version of the world where my land was already spoken for. Where my role was reduced to a signature. It wasn't greed that unsettled me. It was certainty, the kind that only comes from believing resistance is unlikely. That night, I pulled the old files from the cabinet. Deeds. Surveys. Letters I'd kept because experience had taught me memory isn't enough when stakes are high. I didn't feel rushed. I felt clear. And clarity, I've learned, is what comes right before a line is drawn. 2 days later, my son-in-law came to the house. He didn't call first. That, more than anything, told me how the conversation was meant to go. He arrived mid-morning in a newer vehicle than the one he'd driven the week before the wedding, the kind of quiet upgrade people make when they want the world to know momentum is on their side. He parked close to the gate, stepped out confidently, and carried a slim leather portfolio under his arm. I didn't invite him in right away. I finished what I was doing, washing my hands at the utility sink, drying them slowly, deliberately, before opening the door. He smiled the way men do when they expect cooperation. Familiar. Practiced. We sat at the kitchen table. He placed the portfolio between us and opened it without asking. Inside were documents already tabbed, highlighted, arranged in a sequence that assumed progress. He spoke about inevitability. About alignment. About how the land was the missing piece, not just for the business, but for the future he and my daughter were building together. He said my involvement would make things smoother. Faster. I didn't touch the papers. He kept talking, filling the space with projections and timelines, leaning into phrases like, everyone's already on board, and, this is really just a formality. He never once asked if I wanted to participate. He spoke as if I already had. When he finally paused, I told him I wasn't reviewing anything that day. The smile tightened. Not disappeared, just adjusted. He said he understood caution, but emphasized urgency. He mentioned permits, approvals, how delays could ripple outward. He implied, carefully, that cooperation now would prevent complications later. I told him again, calmly, that I wouldn't be signing or reviewing anything. He gathered the papers more slowly than he'd laid them out. He said he hoped I'd reconsider. He said family should want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Then he left, the portfolio tucked back under his arm, the door closing softly behind him. That afternoon, I called my attorney. We'd known each other a long time. He didn't interrupt while I explained. When I finished, he asked for copies of the documents I'd been shown. When I told him I hadn't taken any, he paused, then said that was probably intentional. 2 days later, I sat in his office while he walked me through what he'd been able to infer from what I described. Aggressive timelines. Waived protections. Clauses that shifted risk quickly and quietly. He said the urgency didn't match the type of venture being described. Not unless something else was driving it. I left his office and went straight to the county records building. I've always believed in primary sources. I don't rely on summaries when the original is available. The clerk was polite, efficient. I requested everything related to recent filings near my land. What came back took time to process, not because it was complicated, but because it was layered. Corporate entities stacked inside one another. Rapid permit approvals that usually took months. Familiar names appearing across different filings. Patterns you don't notice unless you're looking for them. By the time I left, I wasn't angry. I was focused. That night, I stood on the porch and looked out over the eastern tract. The land was quiet, unchanged, unaware of the attention it had drawn. I understood then that this wasn't about family at all. It was about access. And once access is granted, control follows. The call I made that night wasn't to family, and it wasn't to anyone who owed me a favor. It was to someone whose only loyalty was to process. We'd crossed paths years earlier over a zoning dispute that had nothing to do with me directly, but enough to leave an impression. He answered on the third ring, recognized my voice, and listened without interrupting. I didn't accuse. I didn't speculate. I asked questions. About timelines. About filings. About whether certain patterns meant what they appeared to mean. He didn't confirm anything outright, but he didn't dismiss my concerns either. He suggested, carefully, that I request a meeting through formal channels. He said some matters were better discussed in person, with records on the table. I slept that night, but lightly. The meeting took place the following week in a federal building that never tried to impress anyone. Concrete, glass, muted colors. I brought only what was necessary. No dramatics. No conclusions. Just facts and documents. The man across from me read quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally setting a page aside. When he finished, he asked me how long I'd owned the land. I told him. He asked if I had any intention of selling. I told him I hadn't. He asked if anyone had attempted to pressure me into transferring it. I told him the truth, exactly as it had happened. He didn't react. He simply thanked me and said I'd done the right thing by coming in early. Early mattered, he explained. Once transactions were finalized, options narrowed. I left without any promises or explanations, but with a sense that I was no longer the only person paying attention. 2 days later, inspectors arrived at my property. They were courteous. Professional. Clipboards in hand, expressions neutral. They cited compliance checks. Routine, they said. Standard procedure. I walked with them, answered questions, opened gates. I've never had a reason to hide anything, and I wasn't about to start. That evening, my son-in-law called. He didn't mention the inspectors directly. He spoke instead about stress. About how complicated things were becoming. He suggested, again, carefully, that cooperation might smooth the road ahead. He said he didn't want things to get adversarial. He said no one did. I told him the inspectors had been thorough and polite. There was a pause. Not as brief as the one during my daughter's call, but similar in tone. He said he hoped everything would resolve quickly. I told him I hoped so too, and ended the call. The next day, my attorney and I sat down to discuss options. Real ones. Not reactions, not defenses. Decisions. He laid them out plainly. If I wanted to keep the land, I could. If I wanted to sell, I could, on my terms. But if I wanted to remove it entirely from the equation, to make it unavailable not just now but permanently, there was a path. An irrevocable transfer. Once completed, it couldn't be undone. Not by family pressure. Not by courts acting in haste. Not by threats dressed up as concern. The land would be placed into a public use structure, protected, repurposed, and legally unreachable. I asked him what that would cost me. He said control. I asked him what it would protect. He said everything else. I didn't decide that day. I went home and walked the land again, this time slowly, deliberately. I stopped where the creek cut through the low ground. I stood where my father once stood, pointing out the best place for a fence. I thought about legacy, not money, not leverage, but intention. By the time I went inside, I knew what I was going to do. I called my attorney the next morning and told him to prepare the documents. The reaction was immediate. My daughter's attorney called first, speaking about concern for my well-being. He suggested evaluations. Impairment. Conservatorship. Words chosen to sound reasonable, protective. My attorney responded with documentation, medical records, assessments, sworn statements. Clear. Unambiguous. Then came escalation. More inspectors. More calls. More hints that things could become unpleasant if I continued down this path. I documented everything. Dates. Times. Names. Words used. Tone. The final confrontation happened at my kitchen table. My son-in-law arrived with 2 associates this time. He spoke less. One of the others spoke more. They referenced urgency. Losses. Consequences. At one point, someone said plainly that reversing the transfer would make everything go away. I asked them to repeat that. They did. The recorder on my phone captured every word. Within 48 hours, the transfer was finalized. The land was no longer mine to give, sell, or leverage. It was gone from the board entirely. Federal action followed shortly after. Quiet at first. Then not so quiet. Names I'd seen on filings appeared in places they hadn't expected. Permits were re-examined. Timelines unraveled. My daughter called once more. Not angry. Not pleading. Just hollow. She said she hadn't realized how permanent my decision was. I told her permanence was the point. We haven't spoken since. The land remains quiet. Unchanged. Still doing what land does, holding steady, indifferent to ambition. I still walk it in the mornings. I still know every boundary. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way people expect consequences to be. There were no headlines with my name in them. No public apologies. No one showed up at my door to explain themselves. Instead, there was a steady unwinding, quiet, procedural, irreversible. The first sign came from absence. The calls stopped. Not just from my daughter or her husband, but from the outer ring too, the acquaintances who had suddenly found my number useful in the weeks leading up to the transfer. Men who had never asked about the weather on my land before, never cared about its history or condition, now found other priorities. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't strategic. It was defensive. I stayed out of the way. That wasn't a tactic. It was simply how I'd always lived. I kept my routines intact. Morning walks. Work that didn't require permission. Evenings that ended early. I didn't speak to anyone about what was happening unless they asked directly, and almost no one did. People sense when a subject has edges. My attorney checked in periodically. He never speculated, never shared more than was appropriate. He told me when filings were challenged and when those challenges failed. He told me when motions were withdrawn quietly, without explanation. Each update confirmed the same thing: the decision was holding. The federal inquiry expanded, slowly at first, then with purpose. That wasn't something I was officially informed of. It wasn't necessary. When people start asking different questions, more careful ones, you can tell when scrutiny has shifted from exploratory to corrective. I had no role in that phase. My part was finished the moment the land left my control. What surprised me most was how quickly my daughter's certainty collapsed into something else. She didn't call again, but she sent one message weeks later. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't conciliatory either. It was practical. She asked if there was any chance the structure could be reversed in the future. I read it once and didn't respond. Not out of spite. Out of honesty. Any response would have implied possibility, and there was none. Some decisions aren't meant to be softened. They're meant to stand. I thought often about the wedding during that time, not the moment I was removed, but the atmosphere leading up to it. The way introductions had been made with purpose rather than warmth. The way conversations orbited opportunity instead of family. I realized the event hadn't been misaligned accidentally. It had been designed that way. I just hadn't been meant to notice until I became inconvenient. That understanding changed how I remembered my daughter, not in broad strokes, but in small ones. How often she deferred language to her husband. How she'd begun to talk about assets instead of places. How her pauses had grown longer whenever I spoke about keeping things simple. These weren't sudden changes. They were adjustments, made gradually, until the version of her standing in that room no longer needed me the way she once had. I don't say that with bitterness. People evolve. Priorities realign. What matters is how they handle the moment when someone else's values become an obstacle. That's where character shows. The inspectors never returned after the transfer. Whatever leverage had been implied dissolved once there was nothing left to negotiate. That absence was telling. Pressure only exists when there's something to extract. One afternoon, months later, I ran into a neighbor at the feed store. He mentioned, casually, as people do, that there'd been trouble with a proposed development east of town. Delays. Investigations. Partnerships unraveling. He shook his head and said some folks thought they could move too fast without anyone noticing. I nodded and said nothing. At home that evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down. The land looked the same as it always had. No signs. No fences moved. No markers shifted. If anything, it seemed more settled, as if the tension that had briefly touched it had passed through and moved on. I thought about legacy again, not as something passed down by default, but as something protected by choice. I hadn't preserved the land for a name or a bloodline. I'd preserved it from becoming a tool in someone else's urgency. That distinction mattered to me. There are moments in life when restraint looks like weakness to those watching from the outside. Silence can be mistaken for compliance. Patience can be misread as indecision. I've lived long enough to know that none of those interpretations matter. What matters is the moment you decide not to be moved. Everything after that is just adjustment. Time has a way of testing decisions after the urgency fades. When everything goes quiet, when there's no one left arguing or negotiating, you're left alone with what you chose. That's when doubt usually tries to speak. I waited for it. It never really came. What did arrive was a different kind of reckoning, internal, slower, harder to name. I began to notice how much of my recent life had been shaped around anticipation. Anticipation of requests. Of explanations. Of justifications I might need to offer for wanting less instead of more. Once that pressure lifted, the days stretched out differently. Not emptier. Just clearer. I stopped checking my phone as often. There was no reason to. Anyone who needed to reach me knew how, and anyone who wanted something from me had already made their move and lost their leverage. The quiet that followed wasn't loneliness. It was equilibrium. People assume estrangement feels like grief. Sometimes it does. Other times it feels like removing a weight you didn't realize you were carrying because you'd grown used to the strain. I missed the idea of my daughter more than I missed the reality of who she'd become. That distinction took time to accept, but once I did, it settled something inside me. I thought back to her childhood often during those weeks. Not in regret, but in inventory. I remember teaching her to drive on a dirt road not far from the Eastern Tract. How she'd gripped the wheel too tightly at first, afraid of losing control, until I told her the car would go where she guided it if she stayed calm. She'd laughed then, relaxed her shoulders, trusted the process. Somewhere along the way, that trust had shifted away from me and toward momentum, toward people who spoke in certainty and speed. I couldn't compete with that, and I didn't try. Competing implies the prize matters. By the time I stepped back, it no longer did. There were moments when I wondered if she understood the full scope of what had happened. Not the legal mechanics, but the ethical ones. Whether she grasped that my refusal wasn't an act of punishment, but of refusal to participate in something that asked me to abandon my own judgment. I realized the answer didn't change anything either way. One afternoon, I received a letter. Not an email. An actual letter, addressed by hand. It wasn't from her. It was from someone I didn't recognize, writing on behalf of an organization now responsible for the land. They thanked me for the transfer. Spoke about stewardship. About long-term use. About continuity. The language was measured, unambitious. It felt appropriate. I folded the letter and placed it in the same cabinet where I'd kept the deeds for years. Not as a reminder of loss, but as confirmation of conclusion. Chapters close whether we mark them or not. Sometimes it helps to acknowledge the hinge. I started volunteering more locally after that. Not because I needed to be useful, but because I wanted to be present without being leveraged. There's a difference. When people don't expect anything from you beyond your time, interactions change. Conversations slow down. Expectations stay reasonable. Every so often, someone would ask about my family. I answered plainly. I didn't editorialize. I didn't defend myself. I said we were no longer in close contact. Most people understood without probing. Everyone has seen some version of this before. The last update from my attorney came late in the season. He told me several investigations had concluded. Charges had been filed in some cases. Settlements in others. He didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. The outcomes weren't mine to claim. My involvement had been limited to stepping aside at the right moment. After that call, I walked out to the edge of the property one last time before winter set in. The ground was firm. The air sharp. I stood there long enough for the cold to work its way through my coat, a familiar sensation that reminded me I was still very much where I belonged. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently if I'd been more eager to please, more afraid of distance, more willing to confuse love with compliance. I'd seen men make those choices before. I'd watched what it cost them. What I felt instead was relief, not loud, not celebratory, just steady. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. There are endings that look like doors closing. Others look like roads narrowing until only one direction remains. This one felt like the latter. No drama. No applause. Just forward movement without interference. Winter came early that year. Not dramatically, no blizzards or headlines, but with a firmness that settled into the ground and stayed. The mornings grew sharper, the kind that make you pause before stepping outside, measuring the air the way you would a stranger. I welcomed it. Cold has a way of clarifying things. It strips life down to what's necessary. With the land no longer mine in name, my relationship to it changed subtly. I still walked the perimeter when the weather allowed, still recognized every rise and hollow, but there was a distance now, healthy, intentional. Like stepping back after raising a child. The work was done. Stewardship had been transferred. All that remained was respect. People began to fill the space my family once occupied, though I hadn't planned for that. Not replacements, nothing so deliberate, but presences. Neighbors who stopped longer when they waved. Men at the supply store who lingered over conversation instead of rushing off. There's a difference between being needed and being trusted. I'd spent years being the former without realizing how much I missed the latter. Occasionally, news reached me indirectly. Not gossip, exactly, but fragments. A halted project. A firm distancing itself from a partner. A name no longer spoken with confidence. I didn't connect the dots publicly, and no one asked me to. When people sense that you're not interested in claiming credit, they tend to leave you alone. That suited me fine. What lingered more persistently were memories, not of the conflict itself, but of the years before it. I found myself revisiting moments with my daughter that had nothing to do with ambition or land. Her laughter when she was young. The way she used to sit cross-legged on the floor, sorting things into piles with great seriousness, narrating her logic as if it were self-evident. She'd always liked order. Structure. I wondered when that preference had hardened into something less flexible. I thought about reaching out more than once. Not to reopen negotiations or soften outcomes, but to speak plainly, without stakes. Each time, I stopped myself. Not because I was afraid of rejection, but because I recognized the impulse for what it was, a habit of smoothing over discomfort. That habit had served me well in business. In this case, it would only blur the lines I'd finally drawn clearly. Silence, I learned, isn't absence. It's a form of presence you choose when words would invite misinterpretation. Late one afternoon, as daylight thinned and the sky turned the color of steel, I received another message from her. Shorter than the first. More restrained. She said she hoped I was well. Nothing more. No questions. No requests. I read it twice and set the phone down. There was a time when that message would have unsettled me, would have felt like an opening I was meant to respond to quickly, carefully. Now, it felt like what it was, an acknowledgement without expectation. I appreciated that. I left it where it stood. That night, I sat by the window and watched frost gather along the edges of the glass. Patterns formed without intention, intricate and temporary. I thought about how many things in life are only meant to exist for a season, even when we mistake them for permanent fixtures. The following weeks passed uneventfully. That, too, was a gift. I attended to things I'd put off, repairs, reading, small projects that required patience but no permission. I found a rhythm that belonged to me alone. It wasn't exciting. It was stable. And stability, after everything, felt like wealth. One morning, I ran into my attorney by chance. We exchanged pleasantries. He mentioned he was closing out files related to the matter. Final notices. Resolutions reached. Nothing pending. He congratulated me, not on winning, but on finishing. There's a difference. Winning implies opposition. Finishing implies completion. As we parted, he said something that stayed with me. He said most people don't realize they have leverage until it's too late, and even fewer know what to do with it when they have it. I nodded, but I knew the truth was simpler. Leverage isn't about power. It's about choice. And choice only matters if you're willing to accept the consequences. By the time spring approached, the land began to change again. Not in ownership, but in appearance. New growth where old tracks had been. Subtle shifts that reminded me nothing truly stands still, even when it appears settled. I watched from a distance, content to let things unfold without my intervention. I don't know what my daughter tells herself about that year. I don't know how she explains the absence, or whether she frames it as loss or inevitability. Those narratives belong to her now. Mine is simpler. I was asked to give something that mattered, under circumstances that required me to surrender my judgment. I declined. I protected what I could, in the only way that made sense. And when the noise faded, I discovered that what remained, quiet, integrity, a life unentangled from urgency, was enough to build on. That realization didn't come all at once. It arrived gradually, like light returning after a long winter. By the time spring settled in fully, the world had rearranged itself without asking my permission. I took that as confirmation that I'd made the right decision. Life, when left alone, has a way of finding its own balance. Interference is what creates distortion. I started spending more time at the local courthouse, not for any reason tied to the past, but because I'd been asked to sit in on a community advisory panel. Land use. Long-term planning. Quiet work, mostly unpaid, mostly unnoticed. The kind of thing that doesn't attract people looking for leverage. I liked that. It reminded me of why I'd cared about the land in the first place, not as a commodity, but as something that outlasts whoever happens to hold the paperwork at any given moment. There was a day during one of those meetings when a proposal came across the table that looked familiar. Too familiar. Similar language. Similar urgency. Similar promises of economic benefit tied to accelerated approvals. I didn't say anything at first. I listened. I let others ask their questions. When it was my turn, I didn't accuse or reference the past. I asked about safeguards. About timelines that deviated from precedent. About who carried risk if projections fell short. The room shifted slightly. Not defensively, but attentively. People took notes. The proposal didn't fail outright. It slowed. And sometimes, slowing something down is the most effective form of accountability there is. Afterward, one of the younger members thanked me. He said it was helpful to hear questions framed without hostility. I told him hostility rarely produces clarity. It mostly just announces fear. That exchange stayed with me longer than I expected. It made me realize how much of my earlier life had been spent absorbing pressure rather than redirecting it. Pressure can be managed, but only if you don't internalize it. I'd internalized far more than I should have, especially where family was concerned. My daughter crossed my mind less frequently by then, though she never fully disappeared from it. That's not how bonds work. They don't dissolve cleanly. They fade at the edges, retreating into memory until something, an image, a smell, a familiar phrase, brings them back into focus. When that happened, I didn't push the thoughts away. I let them pass through, unchallenged. One afternoon, I found an old photograph tucked inside a book I hadn't opened in years. She was young in it, standing beside me near the creek, holding a stick she'd decided was important for reasons known only to her. She'd insisted on carrying it all the way home, even when it became inconvenient. I remembered how determined she'd been, how unwilling to abandon something once she'd claimed it. I smiled at that memory, not because it explained everything, but because it explained enough. The difference between then and now wasn't her determination. It was what she'd chosen to carry. As summer approached, I received word, indirect, unconfirmed, that the venture my son-in-law had been so confident about no longer existed in its original form. Partners had withdrawn. Structures had been reorganized. The urgency that once dominated every conversation had evaporated, replaced by caution. That didn't surprise me. Plans built on assumed compliance rarely survive resistance. What did surprise me was how little satisfaction I took in that knowledge. I felt no vindication. No sense of having been proven right. The outcome simply reinforced something I already knew: speed is not the same as inevitability, no matter how convincingly it's framed. I began to understand that what had been taken from me wasn't my role in my daughter's life, but the illusion that I could preserve it by accommodating every demand. That illusion had been expensive. Letting it go freed more than just land. Late that summer, I attended a small gathering, a retirement dinner for someone I'd known professionally for decades. Modest affair. Familiar faces. No speeches about growth or vision. Just gratitude, shared quietly. At one point, someone asked if I had children. I answered honestly. One daughter. We're not close at the moment. They nodded. No follow-up questions. No awkwardness. Just acceptance. That moment mattered more than I expected. It reminded me that not every absence needs to be filled with explanation. Some things simply are. When I returned home that night, I sat on the porch longer than usual, listening to the insects settle into their rhythm. The land beyond the fence line was no longer mine, but the horizon still was. That distinction felt important. Ownership narrows with time. Perspective widens. I thought about what I would say if my daughter ever asked, not about the land, not about the decisions, but about the silence. I imagined telling her that silence isn't punishment. It's boundary. It's the space where clarity lives when words have been misused. I imagined saying that love doesn't require surrender, and that distance, when chosen deliberately, can be an act of care. Whether that conversation would ever happen didn't matter as much as knowing I was ready for it, without defensiveness, without expectation. As the season turned again, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while, steadiness without vigilance. I wasn't waiting for the next move. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was simply living within the limits I'd defined, and finding that those limits were generous enough to hold everything I needed. Some people mistake resolution for reunion. They're not the same. Resolution is quieter. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives when you stop arguing with what is, and start honoring what you know. That was where I found myself then. Not triumphant. Not broken. Autumn returned without ceremony. Leaves changed, fell, gathered along the fence lines the way they always had. Seasons don't pause for reflection. They move on whether you're ready or not. I'd reached a point where that no longer unsettled me. What did linger, unexpectedly, was the way people recalibrated around me once it became clear I was no longer movable. There were fewer invitations framed as opportunities. Fewer conversations that drifted toward what I could offer, facilitate, accelerate. In their place came something else, simpler exchanges, slower ones. People spoke to me the way they speak when they're not angling for alignment. I hadn't realized how rare that had become. I also noticed how often I'd been used as a stabilizing force without consent. A backstop. A constant. Someone whose presence allowed others to take risks they couldn't afford themselves. Removing myself from that role didn't collapse anything important. It simply revealed what had been depending on imbalance to function. One afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring twice before answering. It was my daughter. Not her attorney. Not an intermediary. Just her. She didn't apologize. She didn't accuse. She sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She asked how I was. I told her the truth, that I was well. She said she was glad to hear that. Then she paused, as if deciding whether to continue. She told me things had been difficult. Not dramatically so. Just complicated. She spoke about pressure, expectations that had grown heavier instead of lighter. She didn't mention the land. She didn't mention the investigation. She spoke only in generalities, as if specifics were still too sharp to touch. I listened. When she finished, she asked if I ever thought about how things might have gone differently. I chose my words carefully. I told her I thought about how things did go, and what they taught me. I told her I believed most outcomes aren't the result of one decision, but of many small ones we make when no one is watching. I said I didn't regret acting in alignment with my values, even when it cost me proximity. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was quieter. She said she didn't know how to bridge the distance now. I told her distance isn't always meant to be bridged immediately. Sometimes it's meant to be respected. I said clarity has a way of emerging when you stop trying to rush resolution. I didn't offer a path forward. I didn't ask for one. The call ended gently. No promises. No next steps. Just an understanding that the conversation had happened, and that it mattered precisely because it hadn't been transactional. Afterward, I sat for a long time, thinking about how easily that call could have gone wrong if either of us had tried to reclaim ground instead of acknowledging it. Restraint, I realized, isn't withdrawal. It's discipline. In the weeks that followed, I returned fully to my own life. I made plans that didn't account for anyone else's timeline. I invested time where the return wasn't measured in appreciation or leverage, but in satisfaction. I took a short trip alone. Drove without an itinerary. Ate where I felt like stopping. That kind of freedom feels small until you've lived without it. There was a moment during that trip, standing at the edge of a quiet overlook, when I understood something that had eluded me for years. The betrayal hadn't been my daughter's ambition. It had been the assumption that my consent was guaranteed. That assumption had turned me from a person into a resource. Refusing that role restored something essential. I didn't need restitution. I didn't need acknowledgement. I needed sovereignty over my own judgment. Once I reclaimed that, everything else became negotiable, or irrelevant. As the year wound down, the story that had once dominated my thoughts took on the shape of something complete. Not resolved in the sense of reconciliation, but concluded in the sense of understanding. I knew what had happened. I knew why. And most importantly, I knew who I was because of it. Some people look for justice in outcomes. I've learned to look for it in alignment. I acted when it mattered. I protected what couldn't be replaced. I refused to be hurried into surrender. And when the noise faded, I stood where I'd chosen to stand. That was enough. The rest, whatever comes next, will be built on that foundation, not on fear of losing access, approval, or affection. After that call, something subtle but permanent shifted. Not between us, there was still distance there, but within me. I stopped replaying conversations that hadn't happened. Stopped preparing answers to questions no one was asking. When you let go of imagined futures, you gain back an enormous amount of present time. I began sorting through things I'd postponed for years. Not out of urgency, but out of respect, for myself, for the time I still had. Old boxes in the storage room. Files I'd kept long after their relevance had expired. Objects whose only remaining function was to anchor me to versions of myself I no longer inhabited. I found letters from my daughter written when she was away at school. Long, uneven handwriting. Pages filled with small observations, classes she liked, people she found intimidating, the relief of figuring things out on her own. She'd signed everyone the same way. Not formally. Not affectionately. Just her name, underlined once, as if asserting presence mattered more than tone. Those letters didn't accuse me of anything. They didn't demand explanations. They reminded me that our relationship hadn't always been transactional, or strategic, or burdened with expectation. It had once been simple. That knowledge didn't reopen wounds. It contextualized them. I kept the letters and discarded the rest. Around that time, I was asked to speak briefly at a local forum, not as an expert, but as someone with long exposure to land stewardship. I declined at first. Public speaking had never interested me. But they weren't looking for instruction. They wanted perspective. That felt different. I spoke plainly. About patience. About resisting urgency when it comes wrapped in certainty. About how land doesn't respond well to people who treat it as a shortcut. I didn't reference my own experience directly. I didn't need to. The room was quiet in a way that told me people were listening for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Afterward, a woman approached me. Younger. Thoughtful. She said her father had stopped speaking to her years earlier after a disagreement over money. She said she'd always believed silence meant punishment. Listening to me, she wondered if it might also mean refusal to participate in something that felt wrong. I told her silence can mean many things. The danger comes from assuming it means nothing. She thanked me and left. I never saw her again. But that exchange stayed with me longer than most conversations I'd had that year. Winter came back, steady and predictable. I settled into it without resistance. There were nights when I felt the absence of family more sharply, holidays have a way of highlighting empty chairs, but I didn't reach for distraction. I let the feeling pass through me the way cold passes through a house that's built properly. It registers. It doesn't destabilize. One evening, as I sat reading, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was my daughter again. Shorter this time. Less guarded. She said she was trying to understand where ambition ends and entitlement begins. She said she wasn't sure she'd seen the difference clearly before. I read the message slowly. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't care, but because some statements deserve to stand on their own before they're answered. When I did reply, I kept it brief. I told her that insight usually arrives after cost, not before. I told her I hoped she was giving herself time to think without pressure. She replied with a single word. Trying. That was enough. I turned the phone off and went back to my book. Not because the conversation was over, but because it no longer required vigilance. There was no negotiation underway. No outcome to manage. Just two people acknowledging that something had been misunderstood, and that understanding takes time. As the year closed, I felt something settle into place that had eluded me for a long time. Not forgiveness, not yet, but release. The understanding that I wasn't responsible for carrying relationships alone. That mutuality isn't something you demand. It's something you allow space for. I had done what I could without betraying myself. Whatever came next, reconnection, continued distance, something in between, would have to meet me where I stood, not where I'd once been willing to bend. And for the first time, that felt not like loss, but like stability earned the hard way. There's a point after conflict where nothing new is happening, but everything is still changing. That was where I found myself then. No meetings. No legal updates. No pressure disguised as concern. Just time doing what time does, testing whether the ground beneath your decisions is solid or only temporarily quiet. I paid closer attention to how my days felt. Not how they looked from the outside, but how they carried weight internally. Mornings no longer began with a low-grade alertness, the kind that makes you check your phone before your feet hit the floor. I woke up neutral. That neutrality was hard-won. It meant nothing was waiting to extract something from me. I spent more time with people who asked nothing beyond presence. A neighbor who stopped by to return a tool and stayed for coffee. A man I knew casually who asked if I'd help him think through a decision, not to decide for him, just to talk it out. Those conversations were slow, unambitious, and honest. They reminded me that usefulness doesn't require surrender. My daughter didn't reach out again for a while. I didn't interpret that as retreat or avoidance. Some realizations need silence to take root. When insight is rushed, it tends to borrow language it hasn't earned yet. I was content to let her process without commentary from me. What surprised me was how little I needed validation for the choices I'd made. I'd expected, at some level, to feel the absence of acknowledgement more acutely, to want someone to say I'd been right, or at least justified. That desire never materialized. Approval, I realized, is only currency when you're still trading pieces of yourself for acceptance. One evening, I found myself going through old financial records, not out of necessity, but curiosity. I traced patterns I hadn't noticed before. How often I'd stepped in quietly to stabilize things for others. How frequently I'd smoothed outcomes without ever being asked if I wanted to. It wasn't exploitation in the dramatic sense. It was reliance that had never been examined. I understood then that what had happened with the land wasn't an anomaly. It was a culmination. A final test of whether I would continue to be the unspoken solution to problems I hadn't created. Failing that test would have cost me more than acreage. It would have cost me authority over my own life. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Late that month, I received a formal notice confirming what I already knew: the public use structure had been fully integrated. Long-term plans were in place. Oversight established. My name appeared only in the historical record, not as a point of contact. That was intentional. Legacy without leverage. Contribution without control. I placed the notice in the same file as the earlier letter and closed the cabinet. There was nothing more to track. On a quiet Sunday, I drove past the hotel where the wedding reception had been held. I hadn't planned to. I was just in the area. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Less imposing. Without the lighting, without the crowd, it was just another structure serving another function. It struck me how much power atmosphere has over perception, and how fleeting that power is. I didn't stop. I didn't linger. I drove on, the memory losing definition the farther I went. That night, I thought about forgiveness, not as reconciliation, but as release from rehearsal. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't something you extend to excuse behavior. It's something you practice so you don't keep living inside a conversation that already ended. I wasn't there yet, but I could see the path clearly. When my daughter eventually called again, her tone had changed. Not softer, more grounded. She spoke about disentangling herself from assumptions she'd adopted without question. About realizing how easily certainty can be borrowed when it's offered by people who benefit from it. She didn't ask me to fix anything. She didn't ask for absolution. She asked how I'd known when to stop. I told her I'd paid attention to when I started explaining myself more than I was listening to my own judgment. I said that's usually the moment when alignment is already slipping. I told her stopping isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's the decision not to take the next step when every external voice insists you should. She was quiet after that. Then she said she wished she'd learned that sooner. I told her learning later doesn't disqualify the lesson. It just means the tuition was higher. We ended the call without resolution, but with something better, honesty without leverage. That was new. Fragile, maybe. But real. Afterward, I didn't feel relief or hope. I felt something steadier, acceptance of uncertainty without the urge to control it. That's a rare place to stand. It doesn't come from winning. It comes from knowing you won't abandon yourself again to avoid discomfort. As the season turned once more, I understood that whatever shape my relationship with my daughter eventually took, close, distant, or something undefined, it would no longer be built on silent concessions. It would be built, if at all, on mutual recognition of boundaries. And if it wasn't built at all, I would still be standing on ground I'd chosen, with clarity intact. By the time another year began, the story had stopped feeling like something that was still unfolding. It had weight, but no momentum. The kind of weight you learn to carry without noticing, because it's distributed evenly across your days. That was how I knew it was no longer controlling me. I didn't make resolutions. I never have. I've always found them performative, more about announcing intention than practicing it. Instead, I adjusted habits quietly. I declined things faster. I agreed to others more slowly. I stopped filling silence with reassurance. If someone needed clarity, I gave it plainly. If they needed permission, I reminded them, gently, that I didn't have the authority they were projecting onto me. That distinction mattered more than I'd expected. There was a morning in early spring when I realized I hadn't thought about the land in weeks. Not with vigilance. Not with protectiveness. Just as something that existed, the way weather exists. Present, relevant, but no longer personal. That was new. For a long time, the land had been tied to identity, to responsibility, to expectation. Letting it exist without attachment felt like a final release. My daughter called less frequently after that, but when she did, the conversations were different. Not strategic. Not defensive. She asked questions without steering them toward conclusions. She spoke about disentangling herself from other people's urgency, about how difficult it was to sit still when momentum had been mistaken for purpose for so long. I didn't interrupt. I didn't advise unless she asked. I let her hear herself. Once, she said something that stayed with me. She said she hadn't realized how often she'd confused confidence with clarity. How easy it was to borrow certainty when it came from someone who seemed successful, decisive, admired. She said she was learning how expensive borrowed certainty can be. I told her most people don't learn that lesson until after they've paid for it twice. She laughed then. Not nervously. Not defensively. Just a small, genuine sound of recognition. That laugh didn't fix anything. It didn't undo distance. But it marked a shift. One you don't rush past. I didn't ask about her marriage. She didn't volunteer details. That boundary held without needing to be named. Boundaries, when respected, rarely require explanation. There were moments, quiet ones, when I wondered if I should have handled things differently at the beginning. If a conversation earlier, a firmer refusal sooner, might have prevented the escalation altogether. I examined those thoughts honestly, without self-flagellation. What I saw was this: I'd acted according to the information and emotional context I had at the time. Expecting past versions of ourselves to possess future clarity is a form of cruelty we rarely acknowledge. I stopped doing that to myself. One afternoon, I found myself back near the county records office for unrelated business. As I waited, I watched people come and go, some anxious, some impatient, some visibly relieved. Everyone there was trying to fix something, secure something, protect something. It occurred to me how much of adult life is spent negotiating permanence in a world that resists it. When my number was called, I handled what I'd come for quickly. As I left, the clerk looked up and said my name, recognizing it. She paused, then said quietly that the land transfer I'd initiated had become something of a reference case. Not notorious. Just instructive. People cited it when discussing alternatives to private acquisition. She said it had shifted a few internal conversations. I thanked her and left without comment. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, not pride, but closure. The understanding that an action taken quietly, without spectacle, can ripple outward without your involvement. That's the kind of influence that doesn't ask anything in return. Later that evening, I sat with a notebook I'd kept off and on for years. Not a journal, more a place where I recorded thoughts I didn't want to lose but didn't need to revisit often. I reread a few entries from the months after the wedding. The tone was restrained, but the tension was unmistakable. Every line carried the weight of anticipation, of waiting for the next request, the next explanation I'd have to offer. I closed the notebook and didn't write anything new. Some chapters don't need commentary once they're finished. As summer approached again, I understood something that had taken me most of my life to learn: peace doesn't come from restoring what was lost. It comes from refusing to recreate the conditions that allowed it to be taken in the first place. Everything else is secondary. My relationship with my daughter wasn't repaired, not in the way people usually mean. But it was no longer distorted by leverage. Whatever shape it took from here on out would be shaped by choice on both sides, not obligation. That mattered more than closeness built on silence and concession. I didn't know if we would ever return to what we'd been. I did know I wouldn't pretend that version still existed just to avoid discomfort. There's a particular calm that comes from accepting that some outcomes are not yours to manage. You can influence, you can protect, you can refuse, but you can't control how others interpret the space you leave behind. Letting go of that impulse freed me in ways I hadn't expected. By the time the anniversary of the wedding passed, I noticed it only because the date appeared on the calendar automatically. I didn't mark it. I didn't reflect on it deliberately. The memory had lost its urgency. It was just another point in time, no longer asking for attention. That was how I knew the story was nearing its end. The year after everything settled was quieter than any before it. Not empty, just unclaimed. I hadn't realized how much of my attention had been pre-booked by other people's expectations until there was nothing left demanding a response. Silence, when it's no longer defensive, becomes spacious. I took on fewer obligations and finished more things. Not projects meant to impress or prove relevance, but long-postponed tasks that had no audience. I repaired an old shed myself instead of hiring it out, worked slowly, measuring twice, letting mistakes stand long enough to teach me something. There's a particular satisfaction in labor that doesn't need to justify its existence. Every so often, I'd catch myself anticipating a call that never came. Not from my daughter specifically, but from that old category of people who once assumed access. When those calls failed to materialize, I felt a brief flicker of surprise, followed by relief. Anticipation fades faster when it's no longer rewarded. My daughter and I spoke occasionally. Never on a schedule. Never with urgency. When she called, it was because she wanted to talk, not because she needed something. That distinction changed the tone completely. Conversations stayed within their own boundaries. They didn't drift toward negotiation or self-defense. We spoke about ordinary things, work, weather, fatigue. Sometimes about nothing at all. There was one conversation, late in the summer, when she mentioned the wedding again. Not the night itself, not my removal, but the weeks leading up to it. She said she'd been overwhelmed then, convinced that if she didn't keep pace with everyone else's expectations, everything would fall apart. She admitted she hadn't noticed how far she'd let that momentum carry her. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer apology either. She simply stated it as fact, the way someone does when they're no longer trying to shape how the truth lands. I told her something I hadn't said out loud before, that the moment she walked me out of that room, I understood I was no longer being seen as a father, but as a liability. I said it without accusation. Without heat. Just clarity. There was a long pause on the line. She said she'd never thought of it that way. I told her most people don't, when they're standing inside the structure that rewards them for not looking too closely. I told her I didn't blame her for wanting what she wanted. I blamed the assumption that wanting it entitled her to my silence. She didn't argue. After that, the conversation changed direction on its own. We talked about other things. But something had shifted underneath it. The truth had been placed where it could no longer be ignored, and neither of us rushed to cover it. When the call ended, I didn't feel lighter or heavier. I felt accurate. That mattered more. As autumn returned again, I noticed how little I thought about justice anymore. Justice implies imbalance still waiting to be corrected. What I felt now was proportion. Things had settled into a shape that reflected the choices made, without exaggeration or minimization. That's as close as real life comes to fairness. I ran into my son-in-law once, unexpectedly, in a public place. We exchanged nods. Nothing more. He looked thinner. Tired in a way that suggested sustained pressure rather than momentary stress. I didn't feel satisfaction or pity. Just distance. Some relationships end not with confrontation, but with mutual recognition that there's nothing left to exchange. That was enough. The land came up less and less in conversation with others. When it did, it was spoken of abstractly, as a case, a precedent, an example. Detached from my name. That anonymity felt like success. Influence without identity is a rare thing. It means the action mattered more than the actor. Late one evening, I sat at the kitchen table and reread the first few notes I'd taken after the wedding. The handwriting was steady, but the language was guarded. Every sentence carefully balanced, as if I'd been afraid of leaning too hard in any direction. I recognized that man. I understood him. But I didn't live inside him anymore. I thought about how easily the story could have gone another way. How simple it would have been to stay seated, to smile, to accept the assumptions placed on me in exchange for proximity. That path would have preserved appearances. It would have cost me authority over myself. I'd seen that trade before. I knew how it ended. What I chose instead wasn't dramatic. It didn't make me admirable or heroic. It made me unavailable for misuse. That's a quieter kind of strength, but it lasts longer. As the year drew to a close, I felt no need to mark it. No anniversary. No symbolic gesture. Life had resumed its natural scale. The noise had faded. The lesson had integrated. I understood then that dignity isn't something you reclaim in a single act. It's something you protect through consistency, by refusing to explain yourself to people who've already decided not to listen, by standing still when others insist movement is mandatory, by accepting the cost of integrity without trying to negotiate it down. That understanding didn't isolate me. It clarified me. And with that clarity came something I hadn't expected when this began, a sense that nothing essential had been taken from me after all. What I'd lost were illusions, about permanence, about obligation, about how far love could stretch before it became self-erasure. The last thing to settle wasn't legal or familial. It was internal. I noticed it one morning without ceremony, the way you notice your breathing has changed only after it already has. I was standing at the sink, watching light move across the counter, and I realized I wasn't bracing for anything. Not a call. Not a demand. Not a shift in tone that would require recalibration. My shoulders were where they belonged. My thoughts were unguarded. That was new. When people talk about closure, they often mean reconciliation. An embrace. A return. I've learned closure doesn't require any of that. Closure is when a memory can exist without pulling you backward or pushing you forward. It's when the past stops lobbying for influence. That's what finally happened. My daughter and I still speak, though not often. When we do, it's measured and honest. There are no negotiations disguised as conversation. No implied debts. No future plans being positioned as foregone conclusions. We talk as two adults who understand that proximity isn't proof of respect, and distance isn't proof of rejection. Sometimes that's all a relationship can be, and sometimes that's enough. I no longer imagine alternate versions of the night I was removed from that wedding. No retorts I should have offered. No scenes where I stayed seated and the room shifted around me. That night happened exactly as it needed to. It showed me the truth without disguise. Anything else would have delayed the lesson. The land, now fully beyond me, continues on its own timeline. I hear occasional updates through others, projects planned carefully, oversight taken seriously, no urgency allowed to outrun process. I like that. Land responds well to patience. So do people, when they're given the chance. I've been asked, a few times now, whether I regret the finality of my decision. Whether I wish I'd left a door open, just in case. I answer the same way every time. A door that exists only to be used against you isn't a door. It's leverage. Closing it wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of self-respect. What I gained wasn't vindication. It wasn't control. It was alignment, the rare condition where your actions no longer require explanation to yourself. Once you have that, very little else feels urgent. There are still moments of sadness. That doesn't disappear simply because you've chosen wisely. Love doesn't vanish when expectations do. But sadness, when it's no longer mixed with resentment or fear, becomes something manageable. It passes through. It doesn't take up residence. I live more simply now. Not ascetically, just deliberately. I choose where my attention goes. I notice when something tries to rush me, and I let it pass. I've learned that most pressure dissolves if you refuse to meet it at its own pace. If there's a justice in all of this, it isn't found in what happened to others afterward. That was never the point. Justice, for me, was retaining the right to decide who I am when circumstances invite compromise. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't seek applause. I didn't burn bridges. I simply stepped aside in a way that couldn't be mistaken for permission. That choice changed everything. The story ends quietly, as most true stories do. Not with triumph, not with reunion, but with peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's agreement. The kind of peace you earn by standing still when movement would cost you more than you're willing to pay. I'm not estranged from my daughter in the way people imagine. I'm aligned with myself. If our paths continue to converge, they'll do so without assumption or leverage. If they don't, I will still have lived honestly. That's the part no one teaches you, that dignity isn't preserved by being indispensable. It's preserved by being willing to be absent.